A homeless girl sleeps in the rain outside a billionaire's mansion, cold, hungry, and completely invisible to the world. But what happens next isn't charity, it's not pity, and it definitely isn't what you'd expect. One man's decision to actually see her will trigger a chain of events so massive that it will eventually shake the entire global economy and force the world to confront a truth it's been desperately trying to ignore. This is the story of how one girl's suffering became the catalyst for something that billionaires, governments, and corporations tried desperately to stop. And spoiler alert, they failed. The rain didn't just fall that night, it attacked. Sheets of water hammered down on the city streets like the sky itself was angry. Like the heavens had decided to punish everyone below with relentless fury. The temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels. Wind whipped through the alleyways with a violence that made breathing difficult, that cut through clothing like invisible blades. The storm was the kind that made the news, the kind that killed people. And somewhere in that chaos, a 14-year-old girl named Maya was running out of time. She'd been on the streets for 8 months. 8 long, brutal, soul-crushing months of sleeping in shelters that smelled like desperation and broken dreams and human waste. 8 months of standing in food lines at 5 a.m., watching older homeless people fight over the last scraps of dignity. 8 months of being invisible. Worse than invisible, actually, because people saw her and deliberately looked away. They'd cross the street to avoid her. They'd clutch their purses tighter. They'd act like she was contagious, like poverty was a disease they could catch. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weather wasn't just cruel. It was deadly. Maya had spent the last 3 hours moving from one inadequate shelter to another, each one more desperate than the last. The subway station was too crowded, too dangerous. She'd learned the hard way that the underground tunnels at night were hunting grounds for predators who preyed on vulnerable kids like her. The shelter downtown had reached capacity hours ago. She'd arrived to find the doors locked, a security guard turning away dozens of people into the freezing rain. The church basement where she sometimes slept had flooded from the storm, transforming her usual sleeping spot into a cesspool of contaminated water and garbage. Every door was closing. Every option was disappearing. Every possibility was evaporating like steam. Her fingers were numb, not just cold, but genuinely numb. The kind of numb that comes before frostbite. Her lips were turning blue, a sickly shade of violet that matched the bruises on her arms from a run-in with another homeless person 2 weeks ago. She could feel hypothermia creeping in like a predator stalking its prey, slowly shutting down her body systems one by one. Her vision was starting to blur. Her thoughts were becoming fuzzy. She knew, with the clarity that only the dying possess, that if she didn't find shelter in the next 30 minutes, she wouldn't survive the night. That's when she saw it, rising above the rain-soaked streets like a fortress of hope, like a beacon from another universe. A mansion. Not just any mansion, the mansion. The kind of place that existed in a completely different world from hers. A world of warmth and safety and abundance. Massive iron gates, ornate and intimidating, surrounded the property. Manicured gardens, probably worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime, drowned in the downpour. Lights glowed warmly from inside, visible even through the storm's relentless assault, like little promises of heat and life. And most importantly, a covered entrance. Shelter. Protection from the elements that were trying to kill her. Maya didn't think. She couldn't afford to think. Her survival instinct, the most primal part of her brain, took over completely. Every rational thought was overridden by one simple imperative: survive. She squeezed through a gap in the gate, rusted, neglected, forgotten by the groundskeeper, and stumbled toward the entrance. Her soaked clothes clung to her body like a second skin made of ice, heavy and suffocating. Every step felt like walking through concrete. Her legs barely obeyed her commands, but she kept moving. She had to. The alternative was death. When she finally reached the covered portico at the front entrance, she collapsed against the marble wall. The cold stone felt warm compared to the rain, relatively speaking. She huddled into herself, trying to preserve what little body heat remained in her rapidly cooling body. Her teeth chattered so violently she thought they might crack. Her whole body convulsed with shivers. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it was useless. There was no heat left to preserve. She was dying, and she knew it. But Maya didn't know something crucial, something that would change everything. She didn't know that every inch of this property was covered by state-of-the-art security cameras, military-grade equipment, the kind of surveillance system that cost more than most people's houses. She didn't know that her arrival was being monitored in real time on a bank of screens in a security office 2 floors below the mansion, each camera capturing her from multiple angles. She didn't know that somewhere in this massive building, someone was watching her struggle for survival. And she definitely didn't know that the man watching her on those screens, the billionaire who owned this mansion, was about to make a decision that would alter the course of both their lives forever. A decision that would ripple outward and eventually shake the foundations of the entire world. Alexander Harrington sat in his home office on the 3rd floor, unable to sleep. Insomnia had plagued him for years, a side effect of accumulating too much wealth, too much power, too much everything. His mind never stopped working. His brain was constantly calculating, strategizing, planning the next acquisition, the next business deal, the next way to expand his empire. Sleep felt like a waste of time, like surrendering to weakness. He'd been reviewing quarterly reports for the past 4 hours, watching numbers that represented millions of people's livelihoods scroll across his screen. Profit margins, revenue streams, cost-benefit analyses. All of it was just data to him, abstract, disconnected from reality. He'd been about to pour himself another glass of scotch when his security system flagged an intrusion. Not a break-in, exactly. Not a burglar or a corporate spy. Just a presence. Someone unauthorized on his property. An anomaly in his perfect, controlled world. He pulled up the security feed out of habit, expecting to see a vagrant or a drunk person seeking shelter from the storm. What he saw instead made him stop cold, made him set down his drink, made him actually feel something for the first time in months. A girl, barely more than a child, shivering so violently that even on the grainy security footage, he could see she was in genuine danger. Not a threat, not a criminal, not a problem to be solved. Just a child trying not to die. A human being in the process of freezing to death on his doorstep. Alexander had built his empire by being ruthless, by making calculated decisions based on profit and loss, by understanding that sentiment was a luxury only the poor could afford, only people with nothing to lose. He should have called security immediately, should have had her removed from his property within minutes, should have never even acknowledged her existence. That's what the old Alexander would have done. That's what the Alexander everyone knew. The ruthless billionaire, the corporate raider, the man who destroyed entire companies for personal gain, would have done without hesitation. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was the insomnia, the way his mind had been working overtime for so long that it had finally burned out something important inside him. Maybe it was the fact that he'd just turned 50 and was starting to wonder what his life actually meant. Maybe it was a midlife crisis, a sudden awareness of his own mortality, a realization that all his billions couldn't buy him back the years he'd wasted. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been alone in this mansion for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about another human being. Maybe it was simply that he was tired. Tired of being numb. Tired of being disconnected from the real world. Tired of pretending that his billions made him superior to everyone else. Tired of the emptiness that had become his default state. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something he couldn't name or understand. Something that transcended logic and reason. Whatever it was, Alexander made a choice that would echo through the rest of his life. A choice that would define him more than any business deal or acquisition ever could. He didn't call security. Instead, he stood up from his desk, walked to his private elevator, and descended to the ground floor. The elevator moved slowly, giving him time to reconsider, time to change his mind. But he didn't. He rode it all the way down. He walked through his mansion, past priceless artwork, past furniture that cost more than most people's entire net worth, past evidence of his extraordinary wealth and privilege. And when he reached the front door, he opened it himself. Something he rarely did. Something his staff usually handled. He hadn't opened his own door in years. The cold hit him immediately, a shock to his system. The rain soaked through his expensive silk pajamas in seconds, but he barely noticed. He looked directly at the terrified girl huddled against his wall, her body convulsing with shivers, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Come inside," he said simply, his voice steady and calm, "before you freeze to death." Maya looked up at him with eyes full of fear and confusion and disbelief. This wasn't how the world worked. This wasn't how rich people treated poor people. Rich people didn't help poor people. Rich people didn't even see poor people. They looked through them, around them, past them. They pretended people like Maya didn't exist. But Alexander was already holding the door open. The warmth from inside the mansion was spilling out, a tangible promise of survival. And despite every instinct telling her this was a trap, that nothing good could come from this, that rich men didn't help homeless girls without expecting something in return, Maya was too cold, too desperate, and too exhausted to refuse. She stumbled inside, leaving wet footprints on his marble floor. Footprints that seemed to mark the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. But Alexander wasn't done. And what he was about to discover about this girl would set off a chain reaction so massive, so unexpected, that it would force him to question everything he believed about money, power, and what it actually means to be human. And what came next would shake the very foundations of his world. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's guest bedroom, casting long shadows across the pristine white walls. Maya woke slowly, her consciousness returning in fragments. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her body was warm. Actually warm. Not just warm, comfortable, wrapped in the softest bedding she'd ever felt in her life, under a down comforter that felt like sleeping on clouds. Then reality crashed back. She bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. Where was she? How did she get here? The memories came flooding back in a rush. The storm, the mansion, the man with the kind eyes who'd let her inside. She looked down at herself. She was wearing clean clothes, pajamas actually, expensive-looking ones that fit her surprisingly well. Someone had changed her. Someone had put her in these clothes while she slept. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. She stumbled out of bed, her legs shaky and weak. The marble floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She moved to the window and looked out at the grounds below. Manicured gardens, a fountain, a pristine driveway. This was real. This was actually happening. She was in a billionaire's mansion, and she had no idea why. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," she called out, her voice hoarse from disuse and the cold. The door opened, and a woman in her 60s entered, carrying a tray with food. Real food. Fresh fruit, toast with butter, scrambled eggs, orange juice. Maya's stomach growled so loudly it was almost embarrassing. "Mr. Harrington thought you might be hungry," the woman said with a warm smile. She had kind eyes. "I'm Margaret, the housekeeper. How are you feeling this morning?" Where am I?" Maya asked, even though she already knew the answer. "You're safe," Margaret said simply, setting the tray down on the nightstand. "Mr. Harrington brought you inside last night. You were nearly hypothermic. The doctor came by around 3 a.m. to check on you. You're going to be fine, but you need rest and nutrition." A doctor? They'd called a doctor for her. Maya had never had a doctor. She'd never had anyone care enough to call a doctor. "Why would he do that?" Maya whispered. Margaret smiled sadly, as if she understood the question on a deeper level than just the words. "Mr. Harrington is a complicated man, but he's a good one, underneath all the business and the money. Now eat. You need your strength." Margaret left, closing the door softly behind her. Maya stared at the food for a long moment, half expecting it to disappear, to reveal itself as some kind of cruel hallucination. But it didn't. It was real. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate slowly, savoring every bite. It was the best meal she'd had in 8 months. By mid-morning, Alexander summoned her to his office. The walk through the mansion was surreal. Marble hallways, original paintings that probably belonged in museums, sculptures that cost more than entire city blocks. Everything was pristine, perfect, untouched by the messiness of actual human life. Maya felt like an intruder, like her very presence was contaminating this space with poverty and suffering. Alexander's office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, working on his laptop when she entered. He looked up, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Two people from completely different worlds, separated by an ocean of wealth and privilege. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Maya sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was terrified. Rich people didn't help poor people without wanting something. She knew that. Everyone knew that. There had to be a catch. "What's your name?" Alexander asked. "Maya," she said quietly. "Maya Chen." "How old are you, Maya?" 14? Alexander's jaw tightened. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Tell me your story. How did you end up on the streets?" Maya didn't want to talk about it. Talking about it made it real. But something in Alexander's expression, a genuine curiosity, a real desire to understand, made her open up. She told him about her parents, about how her father had died in a construction accident when she was 9, about how her mother had struggled to keep them afloat, working 3 jobs, barely sleeping, about how her mother had gotten sick, really sick, and the medical bills had destroyed them financially, about how they'd lost their apartment, about how her mother had gotten sicker, and the shelters couldn't provide the care she needed, about how her mother had died in a hospital charity ward 2 years ago, with Maya holding her hand. She told him about the foster care system, about the homes that were supposed to help her, but instead became prisons. About the foster parents who saw her as a burden, another government check. About the one foster father who touched her inappropriately, and how she'd run away at 13 and never looked back. She told him about the streets, about the hunger, about the fear, about learning to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to survive by any means necessary. About the other homeless kids, some of them younger than her, doing things she didn't want to think about just to stay alive. About the complete and utter hopelessness of a system that was supposed to protect children, but instead abandoned them. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. She'd never told anyone the whole story before. She'd never let herself be vulnerable enough to speak the truth out loud. Alexander listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," he said finally, "and I want you to answer honestly. Why do you think I brought you inside last night?" Maya shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "I don't know. Charity? Guilt? Maybe you wanted—" "Stop," Alexander interrupted. "I brought you inside because I saw a human being in danger and I couldn't ignore it. That's the simple answer. But the complicated answer is that I've been ignoring things like that for my entire life. I've built my empire on a foundation of not seeing, not caring, not engaging with the reality of human suffering. And last night, I couldn't do it anymore." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his gardens that probably cost more to maintain annually than most people earned in a year. "I'm going to tell you something, Maya, and I need you to understand how serious I am. The system that failed you, the system that let your mother die, that let you end up on the streets, that let children suffer while people like me accumulate obscene amounts of wealth, that system is broken. Fundamentally, catastrophically broken. And I've been complicit in that brokenness my entire life." He turned back to face her. "I can't fix it overnight. I can't fix it alone. But I can start. And I think you might be willing to help me understand how to do that. Not as a charity case, not as some project, but as a partner, as someone who actually knows what it's like to live in the world that I've been insulated from." Maya didn't know what to say. This wasn't what she'd expected. This was something far more complicated and far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Because what Alexander was offering wasn't just shelter. He was offering something that terrified her far more than the streets ever had. He was offering her a chance to matter. Over the next few days, Alexander began his investigation. He started with questions for Maya, about the shelters, the foster care system, the social workers who were supposed to help but never did. About the bureaucracy, the gaps in the system, the places where children like her fell through the cracks. About the politicians who talked about helping the poor but never actually did anything. About the corporations that profited from human suffering. Then he expanded his investigation beyond Maya. He hired private investigators to look into the foster care system in his city. What they found was horrifying. Overcrowded facilities, underpaid staff, predators who were never caught because no one was paying attention. Children who disappeared into the system and were never heard from again. A network of incompetence and corruption that had been allowed to fester for decades. He looked into the homeless crisis. The statistics were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people living on the streets in his country alone. Millions worldwide. And the wealth gap was obscene. The richest 1% owned more than the bottom 50% combined. Billionaires like him could literally end homelessness tomorrow if they wanted to. But they didn't. Because the system that created homelessness was the same system that made them rich. Alexander had built his fortune by exploiting this system. By cutting costs, by paying workers poverty wages, by outsourcing to countries where labor was cheap and regulations were non-existent, by accumulating wealth while others starved. And now, for the first time in his life, he was actually seeing what that meant. The guilt was suffocating. One night, about a week after Maya had arrived, Alexander found her sitting in the library, reading a book. She was curled up in a leather armchair, surrounded by the kind of comfort that most people would take for granted, but that represented an impossible luxury to her. "Can I ask you something?" he said, sitting down across from her. "Of course," Maya said, setting down her book. "Do you think I'm a good person?" Alexander asked. Maya was quiet for a long moment. "I think you're trying to be," she said finally. "But I also think that doesn't erase all the bad things you've done. I think you can be trying to be good and still be responsible for a lot of suffering. Those things can both be true." Alexander nodded slowly. He'd expected her to say yes, to reassure him. But Maya had given him something more valuable than reassurance. She'd given him the truth. "I'm going to do something," he said. "Something big. Something that will probably destroy my reputation and my business empire. And I need to know if you're willing to be part of it. Not as a victim, not as a charity case, but as someone who understands this world better than I ever could." Maya looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected to see. Hope. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to tell the truth," Alexander said. "About the system, about how it works, about who profits from it, about how many people like you it destroys every single day. I want to expose it all, and I want to use my money and my platform to actually change it." "They won't let you," Maya said quietly. "The people at the top, they'll fight you." "I know," Alexander said, "but I have to try. Because the alternative is going back to being numb, going back to not seeing, going back to pretending that the world is just and fair when it clearly isn't. And I can't do that anymore." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "So, what do you say, Maya? Are you willing to help me shock the world?" But neither of them realized that what they were about to set in motion would attract the attention of people far more powerful than they could have imagined. People who had everything to lose if the truth came out. People who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. And the real battle was only just beginning. The next morning, Alexander called a meeting in his private conference room on the top floor of his mansion. Maya sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by Alexander on one side and a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen on the other. No relation. Though the shared surname had made Maya smile for the first time in days. Dr. Chen was a journalist, a real journalist, the kind who'd won Pulitzer Prizes and had spent decades investigating corruption at the highest levels of government and corporate America. Alexander had called her personally, told her he had a story that would change everything, and asked her to come alone. She'd arrived with a skeptical expression and left with it still firmly in place, though her eyes had softened when she looked at Maya. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Dr. Chen said, leaning back in her chair. "You're a billionaire who wants to dismantle the system that made you rich. You want to expose the corruption in the foster care system, the homelessness crisis, the wage exploitation, all of it. And you want to do it using your money and your platform as a weapon against the very people you've been doing business with for decades." "That's accurate," Alexander said calmly. And you understand that this will destroy you, Dr. Chen continued. Your business empire will collapse. Your reputation will be annihilated. Your former allies will turn on you. You'll probably face legal consequences. You might end up in prison. I understand, Alexander said. Dr. Chen turned to Maya. And you? You understand that being part of this will expose you? That your story will be public? That there will be people who try to discredit you, who will dig into your past looking for ammunition? Maya nodded. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it a lot. But she'd also thought about all the other Mayas out there, the ones still on the streets, the ones in the broken foster care system, the ones who didn't have an Alexander Harrington to save them. I want to do it, she said quietly. Dr. Chen studied both of them for a long moment, then smiled, a real smile, not the cynical expression of a hardened journalist, but the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this moment her entire career. All right, she said, let's burn it all down. Over the next month, they began their investigation in earnest. Dr. Chen brought in a team of researchers, data analysts, and investigative journalists. People she trusted implicitly. People who understood the gravity of what they were about to do. They set up a secure operation in a wing of Alexander's mansion, completely separate from his main offices, completely off the radar of his business associates. They started with the foster care system. What they uncovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. The system was rotten from the top down. State officials were embezzling funds meant for children. Foster parents were being paid to take in kids and then spending minimal money on their care, pocketing the rest. Children were being placed with known abusers because the system was too understaffed and underfunded to do proper background checks. Kids were aging out of the system at 18 with no job training, no education, no support network, and many of them ended up on the streets or in prison within a year. But here's where it got darker. Some of the corporations that Alexander had done business with, corporations he'd helped grow, were profiting directly from the foster care crisis. Private detention centers that housed children, for-profit prisons that benefited from the school-to-prison pipeline, companies that provided services to the foster care system at inflated prices. The entire system was designed to extract wealth from the poorest, most vulnerable children in society. And Alexander had been part of it. Not knowingly, perhaps, but complicit nonetheless. The investigation into homelessness revealed similar patterns. Real estate developers, some of them Alexander's former business partners, were deliberately creating housing shortages to drive up property values. They were buying up affordable housing and converting it to luxury apartments. They were lobbying against affordable housing initiatives. They were profiting from the homelessness crisis by keeping housing artificially scarce and expensive. Meanwhile, the wealth gap was accelerating at a terrifying rate. The richest people in the world were getting richer while everyone else was getting poorer. The middle class was disappearing. Wages had stagnated for decades, while productivity had skyrocketed. A single medical emergency could bankrupt an entire family. People were working full-time jobs and still couldn't afford housing. And the system was designed this way, deliberately, by people at the top who understood exactly what they were doing. One evening, as Alexander reviewed the data, he found himself staring at a spreadsheet. It showed his own wealth accumulation over the past 20 years. Billions of dollars. Billions that had come from paying workers poverty wages, from outsourcing jobs to countries with no labor protections, from cutting corners on safety and environmental standards, from lobbying against regulations that would have protected workers and consumers. He'd built his fortune on the backs of people like Maya, millions of them. The realization was physically nauseating. But the investigation didn't stop at the foster care system or homelessness. It expanded outward, like ripples in a pond. They looked at the pharmaceutical industry, at how insulin prices had tripled in a decade, pricing diabetics out of their own medicine, at how pharmaceutical companies were paying doctors to prescribe opioids, creating an addiction crisis that was killing hundreds of thousands of people, at how they were more interested in profitable drugs for rich people's problems than in cures for diseases that affected the poor. They looked at the education system, at how schools in poor neighborhoods were crumbling while schools in wealthy neighborhoods had state-of-the-art facilities, at how the standardized testing industry was profiting from inequality, at how college had become unaffordable, leaving students drowning in debt before they even started their careers. They looked at the criminal justice system, at how poor people were more likely to be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned than wealthy people who committed the same crimes, at how private prisons were lobbying for harsher sentences to keep their facilities full, at how bail was being used as a tool of oppression against the poor. They looked at the media, at how major news outlets were owned by billionaires and corporations with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, at how certain stories were suppressed while others were amplified, at how the narrative of the American dream was being used to blame poor people for their own poverty. Every thread they pulled led to the same conclusion. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to extract wealth from the poor and concentrate it in the hands of the rich. It was designed to maintain inequality. It was designed to benefit people like Alexander while destroying people like Maya. And the people at the top knew it. They understood it completely. They just didn't care. One night, about 6 weeks into the investigation, Maya found Alexander sitting alone in his study, staring at nothing. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Alexander looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Genuine despair. "I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth," he said quietly. "I thought I was successful. I thought I was winning. But what I actually did was participate in a system of organized theft. I stole from millions of people. I stole their dignity, their opportunities, their futures. And I did it while telling myself that I was a good person, that I'd earned my success through hard work and intelligence." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below, a city full of people struggling to survive, while he sat in a mansion worth more than most neighborhoods. "The worst part," he continued, "is that I could have done something about it. I had the power. I had the resources. But I chose not to see. I chose to believe the narrative that poor people are poor because they're lazy or stupid or lacking in ambition. I chose to believe that I deserved my wealth and they deserved their poverty. And in doing so, I perpetuated a system that destroyed countless lives." Maya didn't know what to say. She moved closer to him, standing beside him at the window. "You're trying to change it now," she said finally. "Am I?" Alexander asked bitterly. "Or am I just trying to ease my conscience? Am I trying to actually fix the system? Or am I just trying to feel better about my complicity?" "I don't know," Maya said honestly. "But I know that what you're doing matters. I know that the people you're about to expose won't be happy about it. And I know that you're risking everything. That has to mean something." Alexander turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain. "What if it's not enough?" he asked. "What if we expose all of this and nothing changes? What if the system is too powerful, too entrenched, too profitable for the people at the top to ever let it be dismantled?" Then we try anyway, Maya said simply. Because the alternative is giving up, and I'm tired of giving up. By week 8, they had enough material to begin writing the story. Dr. Chen and her team compiled everything into a comprehensive expose. They had documents, financial records, testimony from whistleblowers, data analysis, everything. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. The kind of story that could actually change the world. But before they published, Alexander made a decision that shocked everyone. He decided to go public with his own role in the system. He wrote a detailed confession. He documented every unethical business practice he'd engaged in. He named names. He provided evidence. He didn't try to minimize his complicity or make excuses. He simply laid out the truth. He had been a predator in a system of organized predation, and he was complicit in the suffering of millions. And then he announced that he was liquidating his entire fortune. All of it. Every penny. Billions of dollars. He was going to use that money to create a foundation dedicated to dismantling the systems of inequality he'd helped build. He was going to fund affordable housing initiatives. He was going to support education in underfunded communities. He was going to help people like Maya, people who'd been destroyed by the system. But more importantly, he was going to use his platform to tell the truth about how the system actually worked. When Dr. Chen heard about this decision, she called him immediately. "Are you insane?" she demanded. "Do you understand what you're about to do? You're going to destroy yourself. You're going to destroy your entire legacy. The people you used to do business with are going to turn on you. They're going to destroy you if they can." "I know," Alexander said calmly. "And you're doing it anyway?" "I'm doing it anyway," he confirmed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay," Dr. Chen said finally. "Then let's make sure it counts. Let's make sure that when we publish this story, it's so comprehensive, so undeniable, so explosive, that the entire world has to pay attention. Let's make sure that what you're about to sacrifice actually means something." The night before the story was scheduled to break, Maya couldn't sleep. She wandered through the mansion, eventually ending up in the library. She pulled a book off the shelf at random and found herself reading about revolutions, about how change had always come from people who were willing to risk everything, about how systems of oppression always fought back, always tried to destroy anyone who threatened them. She thought about what was about to happen, about how the story would go public, about how the media would explode, about how the people Alexander had exposed would fight back with everything they had. She thought about how her life would change, how she would no longer be invisible, how her story would be known by millions of people, how some of them would sympathize with her, and others would try to tear her down. And she thought about all the other Mayas out there, the ones still on the streets, the ones still in the broken foster care system, the ones who didn't have someone like Alexander to save them. Maybe, she thought, this could be the beginning of something. Maybe this could be the moment when people finally started to see, when they finally understood how the system actually worked, when they finally decided that enough was enough. She fell asleep in the library, surrounded by books about revolutions and change. And tomorrow, whether she was ready or not, the revolution would begin. But what neither Alexander, nor Maya, nor Dr. Chen anticipated was just how powerful the forces arrayed against them actually were. They were about to discover that the system they were trying to expose had teeth. And those teeth were about to bite back in ways that would test everything they believed in. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The article went live at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Within minutes, it had been shared thousands of times. Within an hour, it was trending on every social media platform. Within 2 hours, every major news outlet in the country was covering it. By noon, it was the top story worldwide. The headline was simple and devastating. Billionaire exposes trillion-dollar system of organized inequality. How the wealthy deliberately keep the poor trapped. The article was comprehensive. It detailed the foster care corruption, the homelessness crisis, the wage exploitation, the pharmaceutical price gouging, the education inequality, the criminal justice system bias, everything. And it was backed up by mountains of evidence. Financial records, government documents, testimony from whistleblowers, data analysis that was impossible to refute. But what made the story truly explosive was Alexander's personal confession. A billionaire admitting that he'd built his fortune on the suffering of others. A billionaire publicly denouncing the system that had made him rich. A billionaire announcing that he was liquidating his entire fortune to fight against inequality. The reaction was immediate and polarized. On social media, some people hailed Alexander as a hero. Finally, someone from the inside was telling the truth. Finally, someone with power and resources was using them to fight the system. Hashtags began trending. Alexander Truth, Beast System Exposed, Yeasties Change is Now. But others were far less charitable. Conservative media outlets immediately began attacking Alexander, calling him a traitor to capitalism, a self-hating billionaire, a communist sympathizer. They questioned his motives. They suggested he was having a mental breakdown. They tried to discredit him by digging into his past, looking for scandals they could use against him. Corporate America went into panic mode. The companies Alexander had exposed began issuing statements, denying everything, claiming that the article was misleading, that the data was taken out of context, that Alexander was a disgruntled former executive trying to damage their reputations. They hired the best PR firms money could buy. They hired armies of lawyers. They prepared for war. And then they went after Alexander personally. By that afternoon, the attacks had begun in earnest. His former business associates issued statements denouncing him. His board of directors called an emergency meeting and voted to remove him from his own company. His lawyers informed him that he was facing multiple lawsuits from corporations claiming defamation. The IRS announced they were opening an investigation into his taxes. Federal prosecutors were looking into whether he'd violated securities laws by not disclosing his intentions to liquidate his company before the article went public. It was a coordinated assault, orchestrated by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. But Alexander had anticipated this. He'd prepared for it. He held a press conference that afternoon, standing in front of cameras with Maya beside him and Dr. Chen behind him. He looked directly into the camera and spoke to the American people. "My name is Alexander Harrington," he began, his voice steady and clear. "For 30 years, I have been part of a system that extracts wealth from the poor and concentrates it in the hands of the rich. I have profited enormously from that system. I have defended that system. I have participated in perpetuating that system. Today, I am here to tell you that I was wrong. The system is not just. It is not fair. It is not the result of hard work and merit. It is the result of deliberate design by people at the top to maintain their power and their wealth at the expense of everyone else. I am liquidating my fortune because I can no longer live with the knowledge of what I have done. But more importantly, I am doing this because I believe that change is possible. I believe that we can build a system that is just, that is fair, that actually works for everyone. instead of just for the wealthy few. The attacks on me, the lawsuits, the investigations, none of that matters, because I have nothing left to lose. I am already giving away my money. I am already destroying my reputation. I am already accepting that I will probably spend time in prison for my crimes against this country. But what matters is this: I am telling you the truth, and the truth cannot be suppressed. The truth cannot be litigated away. The truth cannot be bought or sold. The truth is that the system is broken, and it is time for it to be fixed. He paused, looking directly at Maya. This young woman beside me is named Maya Chen. She is 14 years old. She has lived on the streets. She has been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. And she is braver than I have ever been. She is willing to stand up and tell her story, knowing that it will expose her to scrutiny and attack. I ask that you treat her with the respect and compassion that she deserves. Then he turned back to the camera. The age of billionaires is over. The age of organized inequality is over. The age of pretending that the system is just when it is fundamentally unjust is over. What comes next is up to all of you. You can ignore this. You can believe the lies that the powerful will tell you, or you can join us in building something better. The choice is yours. The press conference ended. Alexander walked away from the podium without taking questions. Within minutes, the video had been viewed millions of times. The response was overwhelming. Protests erupted in cities across the country. People took to the streets demanding change. Demands for higher minimum wages, demands for affordable housing, demands for healthcare reform, demands for criminal justice reform, demands for education funding, demands for systemic change. But the powerful fought back harder. The corporations that had been exposed began a massive PR campaign, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising to convince people that the article was false, that the data was misleading, that Alexander was a liar. They funded think tanks that published studies proving that inequality wasn't actually a problem. They funded politicians who promised to defend the system. And they went after the people involved in the investigation. Dr. Chen's news organization began facing legal threats. Advertisers started pulling out, pressured by corporate interests. Her editor was offered a massive bribe to kill the story. He refused, but the pressure was relentless. Journalists on her team started receiving death threats. Doxing campaigns were launched against them. Their personal information was published online. People showed up at their homes. And then they came for Maya. It started with social media attacks. People claiming she was a liar, that she'd made up her story for attention, that she was being manipulated by Alexander for his own purposes. They dug into her past, looking for anything they could use against her. They found records of her time in foster care, details about her mother's death, information about the times she'd been arrested for trespassing or vagrancy. Then it escalated. Someone published her address online. People showed up at Alexander's mansion, screaming at her through the gates. One man tried to break into the property, claiming he wanted to save her from Alexander's manipulation. Alexander hired security. He installed panic buttons in every room. He had the mansion's security system upgraded to military-grade specifications. He never let Maya leave the property without armed guards. But it wasn't enough to protect her from the psychological toll. Maya began having nightmares. She had panic attacks. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. The weight of being the public face of the movement was crushing her. She'd gone from being invisible to being hypervisible, and both states were unbearable in their own ways. One night, about 2 weeks after the article broke, Alexander found her on the roof of the mansion, staring out at the city. I can't do this anymore, she said without preamble. I can't be this. I can't be the symbol. I can't be the poster child for inequality. I'm just a kid. I'm just a scared kid who wants to be left alone. Alexander sat down beside her, careful not to touch her, giving her space. I know, he said quietly. Do you? Maya asked, her voice bitter. Do you really? Because you chose this. You chose to go public. You chose to expose all of this. And I understand why. I do. But I didn't choose this. I didn't choose to have my entire life dissected by millions of strangers. I didn't choose to be attacked and threatened and hated by people who think I'm lying about my own suffering. You're right, Alexander said. You didn't choose this, and I'm sorry. I should have given you more of a choice. I should have protected you better. You can't protect me from this, Maya said. No one can. The only way to make it stop is to make the story stop mattering. And that's not going to happen. They sat in silence for a long time. What do you want to do? Alexander asked finally. I want to disappear, Maya said. I want to go somewhere where no one knows who I am. I want to be invisible again. Okay, Alexander said. Then that's what we'll do. Over the next week, Alexander made arrangements. He set up a trust fund for Maya with enough money to support her for the rest of her life. He arranged for her to be transferred to a school in a different state, under a different name, with a new identity. He hired security to protect her and ensure that her location remained secret. And then, on a cold morning in December, Maya left the mansion. She said goodbye to Margaret, the housekeeper who'd taken care of her. She said goodbye to Dr. Chen, who'd become something like a mentor to her. And she said goodbye to Alexander, who'd saved her life and then inadvertently put it in danger. Will I see you again? She asked as she was about to leave. I don't know, Alexander said honestly. But I want you to know something. What you did, what you were willing to do, it mattered. It changed things. It's going to keep changing things. And that's because of you. That's because you were brave enough to tell your story. Maya nodded, but she didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted and traumatized and desperate to escape. She got into the car that would take her to her new life, and she didn't look back. With Maya gone, the focus of the media attention shifted. The investigations into Alexander's finances continued. The lawsuits kept coming. The attacks from corporate America intensified. But Alexander had expected all of this. He'd prepared for it. He began using his remaining resources strategically. He funded legal defense for whistleblowers. He donated money to organizations fighting for systemic change. He used his platform to continue telling the truth about how the system worked, even as the attacks on him grew more vicious. And slowly, things began to change. Politicians who'd been ignoring the issue of inequality suddenly started paying attention. Activists began organizing more effectively. Young people, inspired by the story, began demanding change from their elected representatives. The movement was growing, but the powerful were not going to give up without a fight. 3 months after Maya left, Alexander received a visitor. It was late at night. His security team informed him that someone was at the gate requesting entry. They gave him a name, James Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. One of the companies Alexander had exposed in his article. Alexander told them to let him in. Whitmore was a tall man in his 60s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He walked into Alexander's study like he owned the place. We need to talk, Whitmore said without preamble. I have nothing to say to you, Alexander replied. You do, Whitmore said, sitting down without being invited. Because what's happening right now, this movement you've started, it's becoming a problem. A big problem. For a lot of powerful people. And powerful people don't like problems. Is that a threat? Alexander asked. It's a statement of fact, Whitmore said. You've opened a door that can't be closed. You've given people hope that the system can be changed. And that hope is dangerous. It's dangerous to people like me. It's dangerous to the entire structure of power that keeps this country functioning. Good, Alexander said. Whitmore smiled, but it was a cold smile, devoid of warmth or humor. You think this is noble, he said. You think you're a hero. But what you've actually done is started a war. And wars have casualties. I suggest you think very carefully about whether you're willing to accept the casualties that are coming. He stood up to leave. One more thing, he said at the door. That girl, Maya, she's not as hidden as you think she is. We know where she is. We know who she is. And if you keep pushing, if you keep trying to dismantle the system, we will destroy her. We will destroy everyone you care about. We will burn everything you've built to the ground. Then he left. Alexander sat alone in his study, Whitmore's words echoing in his mind. He'd known that there would be consequences. He'd known that powerful people would fight back. But he hadn't fully understood the depth of their ruthlessness until that moment. And now he had to make a choice. He could back down. He could stop the movement. He could use his remaining resources to protect Maya and the people he cared about. Or he could keep pushing forward, knowing that doing so would put everyone he cared about in danger. It was the most important decision of his life. And he had no idea what the right choice was. Alexander's decision in the coming hours would set off a chain of events that would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the entire movement for change. Because what Whitmore had threatened was not just personal destruction, it was the systematic elimination of everyone and everything that stood in the way of the powerful maintaining their control. And Alexander was about to discover that fighting the system meant being willing to sacrifice everything. Everything. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He paced through his mansion, Whitmore's threats echoing in his mind like a curse. He thought about Maya, hidden away in some small town, trying to build a normal life. He thought about Dr. Chen and her team of journalists, continuing to investigate, continuing to expose the truth. He thought about all the activists and organizers who'd been inspired by his confession, who were now out in the streets demanding change. And he thought about what would happen to all of them if he didn't back down. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He called Dr. Chen first. "We need to talk," he said when she answered. "In person, not over the phone, not electronically. We need to meet somewhere secure." They met in a small coffee shop in a nondescript neighborhood, the kind of place where no one paid attention to anyone else. Dr. Chen arrived with two of her most trusted journalists, both of them looking exhausted and wary. "Whitmore came to see me last night," Alexander said, and he recounted the entire conversation. Dr. Chen's expression grew darker with each word. "They're escalating," she said when he finished. "This is what happens when you start winning. The powerful get desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things." "I know," Alexander said. "Which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you willing to continue? Knowing what you now know? Knowing that they will come after you, after your team, after everyone you care about?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at her two colleagues. "What do you think?" she asked them. One of them, a man named Marcus, who'd been investigating corruption for 20 years, spoke first. "I've spent my entire career trying to expose the truth. I've been threatened before. I've had my life disrupted before. But I've never been this close to actually making a difference. I'm not backing down now." The other journalist, a woman named Lisa, nodded in agreement. "Same. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Dr. Chen turned back to Alexander. "We continue, but we do it smart. We prepare for the worst. We protect ourselves and the people we care about. And we make sure that when they come at us, we're ready." Over the next week, they began their preparations. Dr. Chen's news organization moved their entire operation to a secure location. They implemented military-grade encryption on all their communications. They hired security consultants who specialized in protecting journalists from corporate and government threats. Alexander did the same with his foundation. He moved his remaining assets to offshore accounts that would be difficult to trace or seize. He hired lawyers who specialized in defending people against corporate litigation. He began documenting everything, every threat, every attack, every attempt to suppress the truth. But more importantly, they accelerated their investigation. Dr. Chen's team began looking deeper into the connections between the corporations, the government, and the criminal underworld. What they found was staggering. The lines between legitimate business and organized crime were blurred to the point of non-existence. Corporations were using the same tactics as criminal organizations: intimidation, bribery, violence. And the government was complicit, often actively participating in the corruption. They found evidence of bribes paid to politicians. They found evidence of government officials who were directly profiting from the inequality they were supposed to be regulating. They found evidence of corporate-sponsored assassinations of activists and journalists who'd gotten too close to the truth. It was a conspiracy so vast, so comprehensive, that it seemed almost impossible that it could exist in plain sight. But it did. It had existed for decades, and the people at the top had gotten away with it because no one with the resources and platform to expose it had ever been willing to risk everything to do so. Until now. 3 weeks after Whitmore's visit, Alexander received another visitor. This time it was a woman. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She introduced herself as Special Agent Patricia Morrison from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I need to talk to you about your safety," she said once they were alone in Alexander's study. "Are you here to arrest me?" Alexander asked. "Not yet," Morrison said with a slight smile. "Though that may change depending on what you tell me. I'm here because we've been monitoring the threats against you, and they're escalating in ways that concern us." She pulled out a folder and showed him documents. Intercepted communications between corporate executives discussing how to neutralize him. References to hiring contractors to do the job. Discussions about making it look like an accident or suicide. "They're planning to kill you," Morrison said bluntly. "We have credible intelligence that they're in the final stages of planning an assassination. We can protect you, but only if you're willing to cooperate with us." "Cooperate how?" Alexander asked. "By wearing a wire. By recording your conversations with people in the conspiracy. By helping us build a case that we can actually prosecute. Right now, we have evidence of threats and conspiracy. But we need more. We need direct testimony. We need recordings. We need the kind of evidence that will stand up in court." Alexander understood what she was asking. She was asking him to become an informant, to risk his life even more by deliberately putting himself in situations where he could be killed. "What about the people around me?" he asked. "What about Dr. Chen? What about Maya? We're protecting them, Morrison said. We have agents watching Dr. Chen and her team. We have agents watching Maya, though she doesn't know it. We're doing everything we can to keep them safe. But the best way to protect them is to stop the people who are threatening them. And the only way to do that is to build a case that sticks. Alexander looked out the window, at the city below. Somewhere out there, people were organizing for change. People were demanding justice. People were hoping that the system could be fixed. And somewhere else, people were planning his death to prevent that from happening. I'll do it, he said. Over the next month, Alexander became a federal informant. He wore a wire to meetings with corporate executives. He recorded conversations where they discussed paying off politicians and judges. He documented bribes. He recorded threats. He became a walking, talking piece of evidence against some of the most powerful people in the country. It was terrifying. Every conversation could be his last. Every meeting could be the one where they decided to kill him rather than let him continue gathering evidence. But he did it anyway. And while he was doing that, Dr. Chen's team continued their investigation, working with federal prosecutors to build cases against the people Alexander was exposing. The movement continued to grow. More people took to the streets. More politicians began calling for change. More media outlets began covering the story, despite the corporate pressure and threats. The narrative was shifting. People were beginning to understand that the system was not just unfair, it was actively hostile to their survival. And then, just when it seemed like momentum was finally on the side of the movement, everything exploded. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Alexander was meeting with a pharmaceutical executive named Richard Caldwell, who'd been one of the architects of the opioid crisis. The meeting was taking place in a private room at an upscale restaurant. Alexander was wearing a wire. FBI agents were stationed outside, monitoring the conversation in real time. Caldwell was in a talkative mood. He was bragging about his wealth, about his influence, about how he'd paid off enough politicians to ensure that he would never face real consequences for anything he'd done. "You know what your problem is, Harrington?" Caldwell said, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "You still think the system can be changed. You still think that exposing the truth will make a difference. But you're wrong. The system is too big. The people at the top are too powerful. You can't fight us. No one can." "We'll see about that," Alexander said. Caldwell's expression changed. His hand moved toward his jacket. That's when everything went wrong. The FBI agents outside suddenly received a signal that the meeting was about to turn violent. They moved to enter the restaurant, but they were blocked by security personnel. Not restaurant security, but private contractors, armed and ready for a fight. Gunfire erupted. Inside the private room, Caldwell pulled a gun. Alexander dove for cover, but Caldwell was faster. The shot hit Alexander in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to the ground, blood pouring from the wound. Caldwell stood over him, gun raised, ready to finish the job. But before he could fire again, federal agents burst through the door. Caldwell turned to shoot at them, and they returned fire. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, Caldwell was dead, and Alexander was bleeding out on the floor. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the face of a paramedic, shouting at him to stay with them, to keep his eyes open, to stay alive. Alexander woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. He was in intensive care, heavily guarded by federal agents. The bullet had missed his vital organs, but just barely. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. Lucky that the FBI had been there. Lucky that Caldwell had decided to kill him rather than wait for a better opportunity. Special Agent Morrison was waiting for him when he woke up. "You're famous," she said without preamble. "The shooting made international news. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's asking questions about why a pharmaceutical executive tried to kill you. And that's good for us. It's good for the case. Because now people understand what we're fighting against. Now people understand that the people at the top will literally kill to protect their power." "What about the others?" Alexander asked, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd had down his throat. "Safe," Morrison said. "Dr. Chen is safe. Her team is safe. Maya is safe. We've increased protection around all of them, and we've accelerated the prosecutions. We now have enough evidence to bring charges against 17 major corporate executives and 12 government officials. It's the biggest corruption case in decades." Alexander closed his eyes, relief washing over him. He'd survived. And in surviving, he'd helped bring down some of the people who'd been profiting from inequality for so long. But the cost had been high, and he knew that the real battle was just beginning. When Alexander was released from the hospital 2 weeks later, he found a world transformed. The assassination attempt had been the turning point. The public had finally understood what they'd been fighting against. They'd finally understood that the people at the top would literally kill to maintain their power and their wealth. The protests had grown exponentially. Millions of people were in the streets demanding change. Politicians who'd been ignoring the movement were now paying attention. The media was covering the story relentlessly. The narrative had shifted from "Is inequality a problem?" to "What are we going to do about it?" And the prosecutions were moving forward. One by one, the corporate executives and government officials that Alexander had helped expose were being indicted. Some of them were cooperating with prosecutors, turning evidence against the people above them in the hierarchy. Others were fighting, hiring the best lawyers money could buy, trying to delay and obstruct justice. But the momentum was on the side of the movement. For the first time in decades, it seemed like real change might actually be possible. 6 months after the assassination attempt, Alexander received a letter. It was from Maya. She'd written it by hand, and it had been carefully smuggled to him through secure channels to ensure that no one was monitoring her location. "Dear Alexander, I've been following the news from where I am. I know about the assassination attempt. I know about the prosecutions. I know that what we started has become something much bigger than either of us ever imagined. I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm in school now. I have friends. I'm building a life. And I'm doing it knowing that what I did, what we did together, it mattered. It's helping people. It's changing things. But I also want you to know that I'm angry. I'm angry that it took someone like you, someone with billions of dollars and a platform, to make people listen to the truth about inequality. I'm angry that my suffering, and the suffering of millions of people like me, wasn't enough to spark change on its own. I'm angry that it took an assassination attempt to make people understand what's at stake. But I'm also hopeful. For the first time in my life, I'm hopeful that things might actually get better. That the system might actually change, that kids like me won't have to suffer the way I suffered. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for being willing to sacrifice everything. But please don't stop. The work isn't done. The system isn't fixed yet. There's so much more that needs to be done. Keep fighting." Maya Alexander read the letter multiple times, tears streaming down his face. She was right. The work wasn't done. The system wasn't fixed. There was so much more that needed to be done. and he was going to spend the rest of his life doing it. But what Alexander didn't know was that the assassination attempt was just the beginning. Caldwell's death had shocked the people at the top, but it hadn't stopped them. It had only made them more determined, more ruthless, more willing to do whatever it took to protect their power. And they were planning something far more devastating than a simple assassination. They were planning something that would test Alexander's commitment to the movement in ways he couldn't have imagined. Because the real war, the war for the soul of the country, was only just beginning.